The gray Monday morning felt heavier than usual as I walked through the glass doors of Morrison & Associates. The Seattle rain drummed against the windows of our downtown office, creating a rhythm that matched my anxious heartbeat. Something was off. The usual chatter in the hallway had been replaced by hushed whispers and averted eyes. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I made my way to my cubicle, passing colleagues who suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. I had been working here for 3 years, building bridges between our American company and Middle Eastern clients. But today felt different. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that storm clouds were gathering over my career. Mr. Morrison's assistant, Janet, appeared at my desk with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, Mr. Morrison wants to see you in his office right away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My stomach dropped as I followed her down the corridor, past the motivational posters and company awards that suddenly felt like mockery. The CEO's office loomed ahead, its mahogany door slightly ajar, revealing the silhouette of a man who had built an empire but never bothered to learn the names of those who sustained it. I knocked gently and stepped inside, finding Robert Morrison seated behind his imposing desk, his cold blue eyes scanning a document without looking up. The Seattle skyline stretched behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, the Space Needle barely visible through the morning mist. This was the moment that would change everything. "Sit down, Sarah," he said without lifting his gaze, his voice carrying the weight of finality. I settled into the leather chair across from him, my hands trembling slightly as I placed them in my lap. The office smelled of expensive cologne and leather, a stark contrast to the warmth I brought to my client relationships. Morrison finally looked up, his expression as cold as the Seattle winter, and I realized that 3 years of dedication meant nothing to him. "We're making some organizational changes," he began, his words carefully measured, "and your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. But what hurt more was the casual indifference in his tone, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying someone's livelihood. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain about the crucial deals I was managing, but he raised his hand dismissively. "This decision is final," Morrison continued, sliding a severance packet across the polished desk. "Security will escort you out, and you have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings." The rain outside seemed to intensify, matching the storm brewing in my chest. I thought about Ahmed, my primary contact in Dubai, who trusted me implicitly and had been instrumental in securing our most profitable contracts. Morrison had no idea that I spoke fluent Arabic, that I had spent my childhood in Jordan with my diplomat father, that I understood not just the language, but the cultural nuances that made these business relationships possible. To him, I was just another expendable employee, a line item on a spreadsheet to be eliminated. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who prided himself on building international business relationships had just severed his most important connection to the Middle East. I stood up slowly, my dignity intact, despite the humiliation coursing through my veins. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "I hope you understand what you're losing." He barely glanced up from the papers he was already reviewing, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. As I walked toward the door, I thought about the late-night phone calls with clients in different time zones, the cultural barriers I had navigated, the trust I had built over years of careful relationship management. The security guard was waiting in the hallway, his apologetic expression a stark contrast to his employer's callousness. As we walked back to my cubicle, I caught glimpses of my colleagues' faces. Some sympathetic, others relieved it wasn't them. The 15 minutes felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat as I packed my few personal items into a cardboard box. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like a descent into an uncertain future. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who had just lost everything she had worked for, yet somehow still carried herself with grace. The security guard, Marcus, whom I had chatted with countless mornings, walked beside me in uncomfortable silence. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered as we reached the ground floor. This doesn't feel right. I managed a weak smile, touched by his humanity in contrast to the corporate coldness I had just experienced. The Seattle streets were bustling with the usual Monday morning energy. People hurrying to jobs they still had, clutching coffee cups and checking their phones. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the drizzle misting my face, wondering how quickly a life could change direction. The box of my belongings felt heavier with each step as I made my way to my car. My apartment in Capitol Hill welcomed me with its familiar warmth, the Afghan rugs and Middle Eastern art that decorated my walls suddenly feeling like remnants of a life I was no longer allowed to live professionally. I set the box on my kitchen counter and stared at the framed photo of my team celebrating our biggest Middle Eastern contract last year. Ahmed's warm smile beamed from the picture, taken during his visit to Seattle, when he had praised my understanding of his culture and my ability to bridge two worlds. I remembered how proud I had felt that day, how valued I had seemed to Morrison when the numbers were good. Now, just months later, I was discarded like yesterday's newspaper. The silence in my apartment was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the rain paint patterns on the glass, while I tried to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from my colleague Lisa. Can't believe what happened. Morrison is crazy. We're all shocked. More messages followed from other co-workers, each one a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. But it was the missed call from Ahmed that made my heart sink. I stared at his number on my screen, knowing I would have to tell him that his trusted contact at Morrison & Associates was no longer there. The weight of that conversation felt heavier than my own job loss. Ahmed had become more than a client over the years. He was a friend who had shared stories of his family, his dreams for expanding his business, his trust in American partnerships. How could I explain that the bridge he had relied on had been callously burned by someone who didn't even know it existed? The irony was suffocating. Morrison's ignorance about my linguistic abilities would likely cost him the very relationships I had spent years cultivating. I finally gathered the courage to call Ahmed back, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. The phone rang several times before his familiar voice answered, warm and welcoming despite the early hour in Dubai. "Sarah, I was just thinking about you," he said in his accented English. "I have some exciting news about the expansion project." My heart broke a little more as I heard the enthusiasm in his voice, knowing I was about to shatter his expectations. "Ahmed," I began, my voice catching slightly. "I need to tell you something important." I explained what had happened, watching the rain continue to fall outside my window as I delivered the news that would change everything. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear his confusion and disappointment echoing across the thousands of miles between us. "But Sarah," he said finally, "you are the only one who truly understands us. How will we continue?" The question hung in the air like a prophecy. I assured Ahmed that I would do everything I could to ensure a smooth transition, though I knew Morrison had no idea what kind of transition would be needed. The conversation ended with promises to stay in touch, and Ahmed's genuine concern for my well-being. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Morrison's decision hadn't just affected me. It had potentially destroyed years of careful relationship building and millions of dollars in future business. The man who had dismissed me so casually had no idea that he had just severed the lifeline to his most profitable international partnerships. I spent the rest of the day updating my resume and reaching out to my network, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere in a glass tower downtown, Robert Morrison was probably congratulating himself on cutting costs, completely oblivious to the disaster he had just set in motion. Wednesday morning arrived with the same gray Seattle drizzle, but today I was home in my pajamas instead of navigating the corporate maze of Morrison & Associates. My laptop was open on the kitchen table, surrounded by job applications and networking emails when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Morrison & Associates, and for a moment, My heart leaped with the impossible hope that they had realized their mistake. Instead, Janet's strained voice greeted me, carrying an urgency I had never heard before. "Sarah, I know this is awkward, but we have a situation," she said, her words tumbling out rapidly. "The Middle Eastern clients are calling, and no one here can understand them. Mr. Morrison is asking if you might be willing to help with the translation." The audacity of the request hit me like a slap, but I listened as Janet explained that several important clients had been trying to reach the company since yesterday, and their translators were booked solid. I took a deep breath, tasting the bitter irony of the situation. "Janet," I said slowly, "I appreciate you calling, but I'm no longer employed by Morrison & Associates." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear the desperation in her voice when she continued. "I know, Sarah, but this is really important. Ahmed al-Rashid has been calling every hour and he sounds upset. There's also someone from the Kuwait project who needs immediate assistance." My mind raced as I processed this information. Ahmed upset? That was unlike him. He was always composed and professional. Something significant must have happened, something that required immediate attention and cultural sensitivity. Janet continued. "Mr. Morrison said he could arrange for you to be paid as a consultant for a few days, just to help with the transition." The offer was tempting, not for the money, but for the chance to protect the relationships I had built and to ensure my clients weren't left stranded. "I'll need to think about it," I told Janet, though part of me was already calculating the implications. If I helped now, I might be able to salvage the situation and protect the people who had trusted me. But another part of me wondered if this was exactly what Morrison deserved, to face the consequences of his ignorant decision. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the rain-streaked window, weighing my options. My phone buzzed with another text from Lisa. "Chaos here. Morrison is freaking out about the Middle East accounts. No one knows what's happening." I poured myself another cup of coffee and considered the delicious irony of the situation. The man who had dismissed me without a second thought was now desperately needing the very skills he had carelessly discarded. The linguistic abilities he had never bothered to discover were suddenly the most valuable asset his company didn't have. My phone rang again, this time showing Ahmed's number. I answered immediately, switching to Arabic, as I always did with him. "Ahmed, how are you, my friend?" I asked, slipping into the familiar comfort of his native language. His response was immediate and filled with frustration. "Sarah, I've been trying to reach your office for 2 days. There's been a serious misunderstanding with the Kuwait contract, and I need to speak with someone who understands the cultural implications." My heart sank as I realized that in my absence, something had gone wrong with one of our biggest deals. Ahmed explained that the Kuwaiti partners had sent a message about concerns regarding the project timeline, but it had been misinterpreted by whoever had tried to translate it. The cultural nuances had been lost, and now the entire partnership was in jeopardy. I listened as he described the confusion and growing distrust between the parties, realizing that this was exactly the kind of situation I had prevented countless times before. "Ahmed," I said, switching back to English, "I'm no longer with Morrison & Associates. I was let go on Monday." The silence on the other end was deafening, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard before. "Sarah, this is terrible news. You were the heart of our relationship with your company. Without you, I fear everything we've built will crumble." His words hit me harder than Morrison's dismissal had, because they carried genuine emotion and years of mutual respect. I found myself in an impossible position, torn between my loyalty to the clients who had trusted me and my anger at the company that had thrown me away. The rain outside seemed to match my internal storm, and I realized that Morrison's decision was about to have consequences far beyond my personal unemployment. As I hung up with Ahmed, I knew that the next few days would determine whether years of careful relationship building would survive the ignorance of one man's ego. By Thursday morning, my phone was ringing constantly. Janet called 3 more times, each conversation more desperate than the last. The situation at Morrison & Associates was deteriorating rapidly, and Morrison himself was reportedly in full panic mode. "Sarah, please," Janet pleaded during her latest call. "The Kuwait deal is falling apart. They're threatening to pull out entirely, and we can't afford to lose that contract." I could hear the strain in her voice, the fear of what this crisis might mean for everyone still employed there. Through the office grapevine, I learned that Morrison had been frantically calling translation services, but none of them had the cultural context or established relationships necessary to salvage the situation. It was one thing to translate words. It was another entirely to understand the subtle cultural communications that made Middle Eastern business relationships work. The irony was becoming more delicious by the hour. The man who had dismissed me as expendable was now discovering exactly how indispensable I had been. I decided to call Ahmed directly to get a full understanding of the situation. Speaking in Arabic, I learned that the crisis was even worse than I had imagined. The Kuwaiti partners had sent what they considered a routine request for clarification about project timelines, but it had been mistranslated as a complaint about American work ethics. The cultural misunderstanding had escalated when Morrison's team responded defensively, not realizing they were responding to a completely different message than what had been intended. "Sarah," Ahmed said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "They accused us of being unreasonable and ungrateful. In our culture, this is deeply insulting. The Kuwaiti partners feel disrespected and are reconsidering the entire partnership." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of careful relationship building crumbling because of a single moment of corporate arrogance. The rain continued to pound against my windows, echoing the chaos unfolding in the corporate world I had been cast out of. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Morrison just called an emergency meeting. He's asking everyone if they know anyone who speaks Arabic. It's chaos." I couldn't help but smile at the image of Morrison scrambling to find someone with the skills he had so carelessly discarded. The same man who had dismissed me without a second thought was now desperately searching for exactly what I had offered him for 3 years. My colleague Marcus from accounting sent me a message. "Heard Morrison is offering a $5,000 bonus to anyone who can solve the Middle East crisis. Wish I could tell him you're right here." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me. I was sitting in my apartment, fully capable of solving his crisis, while he was offering rewards to find what he had already thrown away. The corporate world's inability to see beyond its own narrow vision was playing out in real time, and I had a front row seat to the disaster. That evening, I received an unexpected call from David Chen, Morrison's Vice President of International Relations. His voice was strained and apologetic as he explained the situation from the company's perspective. "Sarah, I won't lie to you. We're in deep trouble. The Middle Eastern accounts represent 40% of our international revenue, and we're at risk of losing everything." He paused, and I could hear the weight of the crisis in his silence. "I know how Morrison treated you was wrong, and I'm calling to ask if you'd consider coming back as a consultant to help us through this crisis." The offer was tempting, not because I needed Morrison & Associates, but because I cared about the people caught in the middle of this mess. David continued, "I can offer you triple your previous salary and a formal apology from Morrison." The irony was perfect. The man who had fired me for being expendable was now willing to pay me 3 times my worth to fix his mistake. I took a deep breath, weighing my options carefully. "David," I said, "I appreciate your call, but I need to think about this. Morrison didn't just fire me. He dismissed me without ever understanding what I brought to the company." There was a long pause before David responded. "Sarah, I'll be honest with you. Morrison is finally realizing what he's lost. The board is asking questions, and his job might be on the line if we can't salvage these relationships." I felt a surge of satisfaction at this news, but also a pang of sympathy for the employees who were suffering because of their CEO's ignorance. The rain had stopped, and the first hints of sunlight were breaking through the Seattle clouds. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I held all the cards now. The question was whether I would use them to save the company that had thrown me away, or whether I would let Morrison face the full consequences of his arrogant decision. Friday morning brought an unexpected knock at my door. I opened it to find Robert Morrison himself standing in my hallway, looking more disheveled than I had ever seen him. His usually perfect hair was mussed, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his confident demeanor had been replaced by something I never thought I'd see from him: humility. "Sarah," he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "I need to talk to you." I stepped aside and let him into my apartment, watching as he took in the Middle Eastern artifacts and Arabic books that decorated my living space. For the first time, he was seeing me as a complete person, rather than just an employee number. He sat heavily on my couch, his hands clasped tightly together, and I could see the weight of his mistake written across his face. "I made a terrible error," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize what you brought to the company." The confession hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. Morrison looked around my apartment again, his eyes landing on a photo of me with Ahmed and other Middle Eastern clients. "You speak Arabic," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of newfound understanding. "Fluently," I replied, settling into the chair across from him. "I've been conducting all our Middle Eastern business in Arabic for 3 years. I understand not just the language, but the cultural nuances that make these relationships work." His face went pale as the full implications of his decision began to sink in. "The Kuwait deal," he started, then stopped, shaking his head. "Sarah, I've potentially destroyed a multi-million-dollar partnership because I was too arrogant to know my own employees." The admission cost him. I could see it in the way his shoulders sagged and his voice cracked. For the first time since I'd known him, Robert Morrison looked vulnerable. "The board called an emergency meeting," he continued, his business mask slipping completely. "They're furious about the Middle Eastern accounts. Ahmed al-Rashid has been calling the board members directly, explaining that you were the only person who truly understood their needs." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Ahmed for his loyalty, but also a deep sadness for the situation we all found ourselves in. Morrison looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed from what I suspected had been a sleepless night. "Sarah, I'm not just here to offer you your job back. I'm here to beg you to save the company I've spent 20 years building." The word beg from Robert Morrison was something I never thought I'd hear. The man who had dismissed me with such casual cruelty was now pleading for my help. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and I found myself in the position of holding his professional life in my hands. "I've learned something about myself this week," Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength. "I've been so focused on numbers and profits that I forgot the human element of business. I threw away the most valuable asset the company had because I was too blind to see it." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I've prepared a new contract. Vice President of International Relations, with a 300% salary increase and full autonomy over the Middle Eastern accounts." The offer was generous, more than generous, but I wasn't sure if money could repair the damage that had been done. "Robert," I said, using his first name for the first time, "it's not just about the money. You destroyed my trust, and more importantly, you've damaged relationships that took years to build." His face fell, and I could see the desperation creeping back into his expression. "What can I do to make this right?" he asked. And for the first time, I heard genuine remorse in his voice. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline where Morrison and Associates occupied its prominent position. The rain had stopped completely, and patches of blue sky were visible between the clouds. "First," I said, turning back to him, "you need to personally apologize to Ahmed and every other Middle Eastern client. Not through an intermediary, but directly from you." Morrison nodded eagerly, pulling out his phone to take notes. "Second, you need to implement cultural awareness training for all international business staff. And third," I paused, making sure he understood the weight of what I was about to say, "you need to change how you treat employees. No more casual dismissals without understanding what people actually contribute." He looked up from his phone, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Respect. "Sarah," he said, "I don't just want you to come back. I want you to help me become the kind of leader who never makes this mistake again." The sincerity in his voice surprised me, and I realized that this crisis had changed both of us. As I looked at this powerful man humbled by his own ignorance, I made my decision. "I'll come back," I said, "but not as your employee. As your partner in rebuilding what we've both learned is too valuable to lose."